Hello. The worlds of Warhammer are brought to life in a great many ways. Ranking highly amongst them are the stories and the miniatures. But for some, the most inspiring and immersive aspect of the games is the art. My guest today has had a tremendous impact on the way that we have seen the Warhammer and 40k universes since the 90s, and he's responsible for countless illustrations that we would recognise instantly. Amongst an impressive portfolio are the covers to the Circle of Blood campaign pack and Man O' War's expansion Plaguefleet, the Dark Angels Interrogator Chaplain, and perhaps my personal favourite, his Terminators versus the Genestealer Magus. We talk about working at Games Workshop, the process and pleasure of creating Warhammer art, and the inspirations that have continued to influence his later career at Sony and Blizzard. I'm Jordan. This is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Mark Gibbons. Mark, thank you for joining me. I wondered if we might start by taking a little look at your journey to joining Games Workshop in the first place. How did you come to work there?
Well, pleasure to be here, first off. Made a nuisance of myself, ultimately, with John Blanche. I had flirted briefly with a career as a miniature painter, but it was about 18 months of just sending John work unfit for publication that he eventually turned around, I think, just to get me to shut up. They said, all right, you can do a couple of pieces. I was trying to remember the other day what it was I started off with. I know I did a couple of pencil illustrations for Advanced Hero Quest, which I think were for a White Dwarf article. But the first proper work was for the Deathwing and Genestealer supplements for Space Hulk. I was from Games Workshop in Nottingham. I was in my hometown of Cardiff, trying to break into the music industry, playing in a band. So my work as an artist was very much just to pay for like rehearsal studios and guitar strings. And now I managed to break my arm, my business arm wrestling, a professional arm wrestler, which you might think was a stupid thing to do, but it happened. And I spent 3 months in plaster, not being able to play bass or draw. And it was those 3 months of isolation, I think, that made me realize what I missed the most was being an artist. So as soon as I was out of plaster and able to work again, I got onto Games Workshop and said, you wanted me to come up and start in the studio. Well, I think I'd like to now. And that was early 1992.
Right.
Although I'd done a bit of freelance for them. So I'd been up to the studio when it was still Enfield Chambers and seen the mayhem of that location. But by the time I joined them, they were relocated to Castle Boulevard, which was just a wonderful place to work, and entered what I guess I would call their silver age for artists. Not all the golden age artists. Some of the golden age artists like Paul Bonner and Adrian Smith had left. And I did wonder briefly if the only reason I got hired was because those guys weren't there anymore. No, I'm sure that's not the case. And it was in at the deep end, really, at that point. I had dropped out of art college after 2 weeks of painting with custard and gravy using twigs instead of brushes, because I thought this is not how Frank Frazetta did it. So my time at Workshop was very much, an apprenticeship, to be surrounded by still amazing people like, of course, John Blanche and Wayne England and Dave Gallagher and Jez Goodwin. I was just a sponge absorbing everything I could from those folk.
Great. And would you class them as your sort of artist sort of inspirations and the kind of influences that were driving the development of your art at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. John and Jez, in particular, I think, like a lot of artists who sort of kids in the 70s, it's comic book artists. I mean, for me, there was no comic book shops as such, but we had these little sort of antique markets that would open on like a Saturday, and there was inevitably a comic book stall in these, where you go and buy American comics and stuff like, and back issues. And as soon as I saw Savage Sword of Conan, which was a large format black and white Marvel comic, that was it. I was hooked. I mean, I've been reading the Robert E. Howard paperbacks, but as soon as I saw the big John Buscema, Rudy Nebres artwork, I thought, right, this is for me. And Rodney Matthews was a massive influence on me too. Me and Jez talk about we consider ourselves acolytes of the faith of Rodney Matthews, who was at the time there was he was the default poster artist. If you were again into your prog rock or fantasy, you would have Rodney Matthews posters on your walls. So prior to going to work at Games Workshop, it was artists like that, and I guess the artists I would see in Dungeons and Dragons, and then later Games Workshop publications that really kind of drove my direction. And I was a gamer, so started off in pre-D&D. My little group of friends played tabletop war games, Middle-earth war games, and World War II micro tanks. But then as soon as somebody turned up with a copy of Dungeons and Dragons, that basic rulebook one Saturday, and that was it. That was it for all of us. So it was always my hope to end up working somewhere like Games Workshop. I started off doing illustrations for local television and for like advertising companies and stuff like that. But fantasy and sci-fi was what I wanted to do. So anytime I got the chance to do something like that, that was like a holiday from the usual work. So getting to Nottingham and working alongside people that I had admired so much was an absolute treat, and very much shaped my whole career. Really, those what was only I think 5 years. Ultimately, I was working for them first time around. Anyway, was working closely with Games Workshop. Were pivotal.
Mm. Yeah, and you say that getting the chance to work on fantasy and sci-fi was a treat. You would then obviously be working on that day in, day out, and your art featured in so many different products that were released by Games Workshop over that period. All of the Armies books for Warhammer Fantasy, various codexes, and lots of the games as well. What were your sort of favorite projects to work on during that time?
I mean, I enjoyed the variety. I think, to jump from Space Marines one day to Warhammer Undead the next was always a treat. You were never on anything long enough to get fed up of it. Although maybe doing the 5th edition box cover for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, just because it just took so long, I think by the end of it I was quite sick of it. But generally speaking, no, because you moved about so much, it was so good. But I'm drawn towards the dark and the spiky. So certainly the Undead and the Skaven and Chaos were probably my favorite. Although that being said, of the original art I still have in my keeping, bunch of High Elves and Eldar, I'm my favorite. So I've still got some of those. So they must have resonated with me. I think that's because I was working from Jez Goodwin sculpts and concepts. I think that's kind of why I like them so much now, because the ideas weren't really mine.
I mean, that's an interesting point there, just about working from sculpts and things like that. So did you get a brief that would be, you need to draw a load of this or that, and match an existing sculpt? Or were you creating new stuff like whole cloth?
I mean, most cases, because of the way the production runs, the miniatures have to be sculpted way ahead of the art. There's a process. Certainly, if you're even back in the days of metal figures, you need to have cast enough. So by the time the book comes out or you release information about it, you've got enough to sell. And that takes, I mean, that's like minimum 3 months back then. Plastics, when they started doing plastics, I'm not sure what it's like now, but you needed like 18 months to get the molds made and the sprues cast. So inevitably, at the time when it's like, oh, we need some illustrations for a book, it was at the same time as the heavy metal painters were painting the finished miniatures again for the same thing for the book. So there was almost always existing sculpts to base your art from. Later on, that became a little bit more flexible, or I certainly found myself getting roped into the process earlier. So you do an illustration that served as both illustration for a book and the concept for a miniature. That happened later. But usually I would have a miniature. I was handed miniatures and say, right, we need an illustration of this. Or you get a concept art, particularly from Jez, and do an illustration based on this concept. When I went back to the studio in the early 2000s, it was as a concept artist, again, because the sort of the dynamic had changed, and because it was not entirely plastic, but majority of miniatures were plastic at that point. And there was such a massive lead in. It was kind of, right, let's get the concept straight before we go into the sculpting and then the lengthy casting process.
Right. And would you, so from a compositional perspective, was it always that we just need, okay, we're going to need this many of just these miniatures just stood there, or, you know, sort of looking cool, basically, or we need somewhere there's more action or a sort of dynamic battle going on? And that, but how were those sort of briefs created?
I mean, I think we were always encouraged to put our own spin on the art, sometimes much to the chagrin of the factory, who just wanted art that looked like the toy soldiers. And I mean, I did a lot of that. I did almost to fault sometimes. I look at some of my artwork, particularly the early stuff, they're like Space Marines, and I've drawn them with heads way too big and hands too big and weapons too chunky, because I just wanted to draw the miniatures, because I was a big fan. I was a miniature painter, you know. And it was later on I sort of scaled them a little bit more accurately. But it would be things like, well, we need a quarter page illustration of this character or this trooper, so you knew rough proportions that, you know, and you would usually paint like a vignette, unless you knew it was going to be a full page, and then you would do a sort of set proportions. But usually you do a little vignette with a bit of background detail that kind of faded off in one direction or the other, so they could, you know, just so that the art you created was as useful to when it came to reproduction as possible. But it was just, yeah, we need all the troops illustrated. We need some heroes, you know, and yeah, a battle shot. Okay, sure. I mean, John would always do like a big full page army shot, and that would be the template that you'd find yourself using, you know, because there's so much detail in it. You'd like pluck a character out of one of those, and go, right, I'm going to do a call out of that character, and you sit and you draw them. Or you'd find out that, okay, Wayne's doing the regular Chaos Dwarf troop. Okay, I'll do the guys on the rocket launcher. You know, it's that kind of. It was very. We'll find a use for it. And if you end up drawing the same thing that somebody else drew, it's like, it's fine. We've got space in the book. You know, it was very kind of like, whatever you want to do, really, as long as we got all the bases covered. You know.
Yeah, I mean, was it quite tight deadlines then, or were you working to sort of relatively generous time periods? I don't ever recall it being panicked. I always seem to remember there was time. Although, you know, I wasn't at the cutting edge of all that, though. I mean, I did when I was at the studio. I was sat across from the White Dwarf team, which was in a constant state of panic, because it never had enough time to get the monthly magazine out. So it was always running around, and I never felt that. But maybe it was going on, but you know, in the printing department of a particular book I was working on. But it never seemed to be that frantic. Once in a while, I remember there was a couple of, one book I can think of that I worked on where artwork wasn't used because they found out they didn't have the space for it, and that was a Dark Elf book. There's a couple of pieces I did for the Dark Elf book that didn't make the cut because they reorganized the book sort of the 11th hour, and now that was very rare. That I think that only happened once. Everything else was like, yeah. I mean, usually. You see a piece of your art used at least twice in a book. It would be in the background section and then in the army list. So they could always done with more art. You know, there was never quite enough to make a piece, every piece different. Right. I mean, some of that Dark Elf art that you did is absolutely iconic. Just incredible pieces. But so, is there some that did it turn up elsewhere, that Dark Elf art then, or did it sort of just go unused in a drawer somewhere?
Well, one piece I did a Beastmaster with a couple of hounds, and I think I've seen that somewhere else. It might have been like in a third party world of Warhammer book, maybe. But I also did an assassin. That actually they didn't use because they changed what they wanted the assassin to look like. Because I did the more ninja-y and they said, no, actually, we want to do your more traditional cloak and dagger. So that art didn't get used specifically because it was not what they wanted the miniature to end up being. So that's, I suppose, an example of one of those occasions where, yeah, the art came first, but because there wasn't concept art, I went straight to illustration. And they went, yeah, actually, that's not what we're going to make the assassins look like, so we're not going to use that piece. But again, that was very rare that ever happened. I mean, I did, when I think of things like the art I did for the Bretonian book, or for some of the art I did for the Wood Elf book, that preceded the miniatures. So the miniatures were based on the illustrations, and that was fine. That worked out well. Stuff like the Green Knight and Morgana Le Fay came before the sculpts. So fortunately, they liked the art, so the miniatures ended up reflecting it, and particularly nicely, in the case of like the Green Knight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a tremendous design and an amazing miniature, of course, as well.
And a fantastic paint job from Mike McVeigh as well, I think, to do all that, all them curly fronds.
Yeah.
He must have looked at it and go, oh, Jesus, Gibbons.
I read somewhere that you had a hand in the creation of the goblin squig hoppers. Is that true?
Oh, well, I'm not sure if I had a hand in it. I was sort of advocating for them when Rick Priestley had a bit of a. He thought they might be too silly. I think I might have done a couple of goblin and squig illustrations at that point, so I had some clout. And he said, I don't think. I think the squig hoppers are just too daft. And I said, no, Rick, no, they're awesome. And that was the extent of it. Look, I'll draw them. Look, well, that'd be good. Look, there you go. He went, oh, all right then. So the fact that you can still get squig hoppers and then now the little knights with the lances and stuff, I think is awesome. I love all the the squig hoppers. One of mine, but I think possibly my most memorable contribution.
Well, thank you very much for advocating for them, because they're awesome. So in the studio then, I mean, what was it sort of like in a kind of day-to-day sort of vibes? I mean, working with obviously lots of phenomenally talented artists in these incredible worlds. What was the kind of feel and I guess the culture of that working environment?
It was chaotic, and it was the Castle Boulevard studio was beautiful, and it was a 2-story building, but there was an open gallery. So on the ground floor was White Dwarf, was the figure painters, some of the designers. I was down there for my time in the studio, and then upstairs on the gallery were more of the designers, the rest of the artists, and all the sculptors. And there was little offices and stuff up there. But because it was a gallery and it was open, you could sort of shout up and then shout down, and there was just, you could drop sketches down or throw stuff up. And we were a very short walk from the trip to Jerusalem, which was a favorite pub. So you can imagine the perfect environment. Well, let's go to the pub for lunch, and everybody comes back very happy and carries on working. So yeah, it was kind of amazing creative environment. And the studio at that point was led by writers and designers, and so it was a bohemian, I think it's safe to say. Yeah. The fact there was always a little bit of friendly rivalry between the studio and the factory out at Eastwood. They thought they were the real, and rightly so. They were the workshop. They were the people that made and sold the games and we were just. They called the studio the Ivory Tower. That was very much how they felt about us. I'm not sure it was reciprocal, because whenever I went out to the factory, I was always very excited, because they give you a shoebox and send you down onto the factory floor where all the bins were with all the miniatures. Just say, fill your box and we'll weigh it at the end. You pay pennies for all the miniatures you could possibly carry out of there. So I loved going out to Eastwood. So it changed when I went back in 2004, I think it was, when they'd moved to Lenton, and the studio and the factory were on the one site, and the management within the studio was largely from the factory and from retail. The vibe had changed, and there was I'm loath to call it a resistance, but it felt a little bit like that. Certainly the artists there was a quiet resistance to some of the edicts that came down from management. We were quite a quiet rebellion, which I thought was fine. I think it wasn't hostile. It was just managers trying to tell us what to do, kind of thing. That went on a little bit. No, mentioning no names, but it was most of us.
Sure. I mean, because I guess that was a period, that initial time that you were with GW was very much the sort of the beginning of the modern era, I suppose, of Games Workshop and the creation of all the, the Warhammer's, some of its most successful editions and things like that. And then that move to Lenton sort of changed the company, I'm guessing. And you were feeling that on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, it was even when I went there in '92, it was post Ansel, Right. So it was changing. It was becoming more. I mean, corporate is a dirty word, but just more, I guess, professional, less of a cottage industry. We weren't making Realm of Chaos books, all those amazing Orc books that Brian was determined to put out. It was a bit like, no, we've got to do stuff that's right for the business. So there was a bit of a sea change then, and I think when I went back, that change was largely complete, for good and for bad. But I mean, for good, certainly for the business. And ultimately for the players, I think it was probably something that had to happen. For the business to grow. What it's like now, I couldn't begin to guess. Now it's this behemoth. And what daily life is like at the studio, I've not a clue.
Sure.
I still have friends there, and every time I go back to the UK, I try and get up to Nottingham and hang out. But it's been a few years now, so I hope they're all happy.
Sure. I mean, when you were there, I mean, either sort of period that you spent with the company, were there ever any sort of mandates around techniques and what you had to use in order to create your art, or were artists allowed to use whatever was sort of their style, their equipment, their approach?
Yeah, I'm sure if I said I must use custard and gravy like I did in art college, they would not have had a problem with that. No, it was really down to the individual artist, whatever worked for you. I mean, my techniques changed over time a little bit because I wanted the art I delivered to be as free from problems as possible. So initially, my work was all pencil, and I was chatting with the photographer because, of course, you had to physically photograph it and then paste that photograph into a physical book to send to the printers. And I was chatting to the photographer, and he said, "Oh man, the pencil's sometimes really difficult to photograph because it'd be lots and lots of scratchy, and the graphite was reflective, so you'd end up having difficulties lighting the art so it reproduced well." And I was like, "Oh, okay, what can I do to improve that?" And I would always say, "Oh, can you make the print a bit darker because it's looking a little washed out?" But that's what they have to do to make it reproducible. So I switched to Indian ink, which of course is every bit as shiny on a bad day as pencil because it's made with dead crushed up beetles, shiny beetles. So that didn't help. So I ended up putting down Indian ink, and then I go over that with a pencil to try and matte it, and it gets shiny again. And then I've ultimately discovered liquid acrylic, which was a flatter finish. So my technique shifted over time, but it was always just whatever you want to use. We had there was a local art shop that we would just either troop up to and buy all the supplies we needed and bill them to the company, or we'd just phone in orders in the pre-internet days where you actually had to. It was just like, yeah, whatever you need to do the job. I remember once Wayne England bought a load of brushes, and he hadn't realized at the time, I don't think, one of the brushes he'd ordered cost 120 quid. And it became this, none of us dare use it. It became this sort of sacred brush. Today you're going to use the 120 quid brush. Shh, I don't think they know how much it costs. But no, it was very much whatever you need. I mean, most of us we were all again pre-digital, so we were all pencils and paint and ink and stuff like that. And it was just Dave Gallagher was the big airbrush guy when it came to laying down his beautiful backgrounds or his paintings. But Wayne and I would be there scribbling away with pencil and ink. And John, of course, John was whatever work, mixed media, pencils one day, paints the next, inks the next. So yeah, it was whatever got the job done.
Yeah. Did that stay the same as well when you returned?
I went back as a concept artist, and I was still doing stuff in pencil, but I was moving into digital because I'd spent a few years at Sony, where they insisted I learn Photoshop. I was very reluctant initially, but they sent me on this course, and I realized, oh yeah, this is really handy and it's really quick to change stuff, so I'm going to embrace it. So the first illustrations I did when I went back to workshop were again digital. I don't think they were great. I don't think they were particularly. I hadn't mastered the software at that point, so they all, for me, they look a bit shiny and a bit shiny again. They look a bit plastic. They haven't got that grit that I got from pencil and ink. I have eventually I think I kind of mastered it, but it took a while. So when I went back, yeah, most of the artists were still people like Karl Kopinski and Paul Dainton they were oil paints. They were proper painters. You know, the smell of linseed oil wafting around the studio was a delight. I was in pencil, but then finishing off my stuff digitally. Again, so yeah, it was again very much whatever you want. I know now the studio, or even towards the end of my time there, like 2005, 2006. They were moving digital because it was faster and it was convenient and it was easy to adapt the art. So I know that ultimately even Paul Dainton went did digital. Although you couldn't tell, you look at his art from then, and it still feels like a proper oil painting. You know, he worked out what brushes he needed to use to keep his style very much his own.
Was there ever any sort of I guess healthy rivalry amongst the illustrators and the artists, like who could get the most pieces into a given book, or who could do the best version of a specific character, or was it not quite that kind of vibe?
No, I don't think so. No, it was very supportive, and we all had little pet. Certainly going back to the 90s, we all had little pet projects that we were encouraged to indulge in, and very, very, very supportive in that sense. Because we all wanted to do covers. I think we all wanted to do big color paintings just because they're the most fun, and who doesn't want to see their art on the front of a book? But there was a lot of black and white art that needed doing, because when I was there, certainly in the early 90s, it was John Blanche, Wayne England, and me doing all the internal art. Mostly Dave Gallagher did a couple, but he was mainly covers. And then we had freelancers like Jeff Taylor also doing covers. But the internal art, in terms of creating new stuff, we obviously had work from Paul Bonner and Adrian Smith and Kev Walker and Steve Tappin to draw on to fill books with. But in terms of creating new art, there was just three of us. So we weren't getting to do color pieces and covers as part of the day-to-day. So certainly most of my color art, I think most of Wayne's color art, was done as freelance pieces in our spare time. So you spend all day painting Space Marines, and then you go home and do black and white illustrations of Space Marines. You go home and you do your color Space Marine. So they were sort of private commissions, and they tended to be what we wanted to paint, because obviously if you're going to give up your evenings and your weekends, it would better be something you want to do. So things like the Orc Codex cover that I did, or the Chaos World Eater Terminator that I did, was things like, I'd like to do a picture of this. And then the Games Workshop were like, okay, well, we'll find a use for it. We'll put it on something. Yeah, sure.
Right. I mean, what you mentioned there, that you had, or most people had their own sort of like pet projects or projects they were super passionate about. Were there any other specific ones that you were really into and really wanted to make work?
Yeah, well, I said I want to do some undead. So I said, so that ended up being the cover for Circle of Blood, just because I want to paint some again, because I said I like the undead. I suppose I should have said I like Skaven as well, and I could have done big color Skaven painting, because I never did one of those. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of anything else any big color pieces that I did that were not specifically commissioned. When I started at the studio, actually, I did get a couple of color pieces to do in my day. I did the cover for Plaguefleet, the Man of War expansion, and I did the map for Battle for Armageddon.
Right.
And then I sort of transitioned quite swiftly into, now we need you to do lots of black and white stuff now, so no more color painting for you. Maybe the Goliath I did for Necromunda, that might have been, I can't remember if that was a freelance piece or a part of my day-to-day. I don't remember. But there's not that many color pieces. Asmodee, the Dark Angels interrogator chaplain, that was I want to do a Space Marine I want to do a scary Space Marine. I've done the Chaos Space Marine. I want to do the loyalist Dark Angel Space.
Which is, I mean, an incredible piece. Just thinking back to the Circle of Blood that you mentioned there as well, I'm surprised they didn't get you to do a lot more covers like that, because that's an incredible piece.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, I think it was just down to the amount of work they needed covered. They did. I think the last color piece that they actually commissioned and said, yes, you're going to do this in your day, was the 5th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And I said, yeah, don't give me any more of them. It's too much. It's just takes too long. It's exhausting to paint all them little, build this massive battle scene. Can I just do one guy looking cool? How about that?
I mean, so you mentioned that you left Games Workshop and you went to work at Sony and you went to work at Blizzard and worked on a number of different IPs there. I mean, what were they like compared to the work you were doing at Workshop?
I mean, different in terms of it was all concept art, at places like Blizzard and at like Riot. It's the world building part, which I mean, I suppose I'd done some of at Workshop, but there was so much stuff that was there to draw on. But I suppose in that I got a good training in what great IP building and world shaping was all about from people around me. So by the time I got to work on things like World of Warcraft, I had a pretty good grasp on how to do that. I mean, obviously, Warcraft leans quite heavily into Warhammer as a source of inspiration. You just got to make the shoulder pads bigger, and the sword bigger, and the sword's bigger, and it was just more whimsical, But fundamentally, it's still orcs and goblins, and it's still mighty heroes and dreadful monsters, and it was very kind of free and encouraging. There was lots of saying, "What do you think about this? What do you you're working not just with artists, you're working a lot with designers in the early stages of mapping out a location. What do you think? What should this be?" And they would do these little top-down maps that were just shapes. Oh, okay, we're going to have a village here, and there's going to be a forest there, and there's going to be a river flowing through this, and there'll be a dreadful castle here that we can raid in. And then I would take those and I would draw little isometric maps and sketch all the little bits of detail in. And then I'd give them back to the designers and they'd go, "Oh, this is awesome. We'll just use this then," and they would build the thing out. So that back and forth between art and design was really fun. So yeah, very inclusive and encouraging in the whole sort of where ideas could come from and how things would develop. But yeah, fundamentally, it's still about tapping into those great archetypes of fantasy and science fiction that kind of resonate across whatever kind of game you're playing, whatever media you're experiencing, whether it's movies or games or anything like that. It all touches on that those the great myths of historical reference.
Yeah,
I just tend to find that tends to be what that resonates most with people. Yes, you can go off and do very peculiar, very particular, very unique stuff, but I don't know how big an audience that ever finds. And certainly when you're working with the bigger studios, it is kind of it's sort of an unwritten rule that you want to make sure that you make stuff that has great appeal. You can't go too niche. As much as it is nice to paddle in the shallower waters to make games that are like, oh, this is just a little snapshot of the 41st millennium. I'm just going to focus in on this one bit. It's always with a sense that this is part of a bigger world. So if you do Necromunda, that's awesome. But remember, there are Space Marines out there too.
Yeah. I mean, is it a different feeling when you're sort of creating art? So that sort of concept art space where you're creating stuff and it's very collaborative, and you don't end with a kind of discrete end product, I guess. So if you're, like you say about artists, you like to see the piece of art on the cover, and then you can see that, and there's like there is my work, and I can sort of see it and touch it and feel it. Whereas if it's all part of a bigger piece of work, a game or a sort of world, what sort of feeling? How does that differ in terms of your sort of not quite satisfaction, but your sort of engagement with the end product, I suppose?
I suppose, yeah, it's a different mindset, but it's the reward is a little different, but it's still very gratifying to see a concept sketch you've done translate into a 3D model and see it running around in a world that animated and talking and stuff. That's a whole. That's I can't say it's better, but it's every bit as good to be part of that kind of experience for people who see it and engage with it. It's really you're in there, you're in the world then, and it's kind of, rather than looking at a nice interpretation of it, it feels it's satisfying in a different way, but no less satisfying.
Yeah, and then that brought you back to Games Workshop, like you mentioned. So you returned on a sort of concept, doing concept art for GW in the 2000s. What brought you back to the worlds of Warhammer, I suppose? And was there still some stuff unfulfilled, or was it another reason?
This was before I went to Blizzard and things like that. This is when I was at Sony, and the game we started making at Sony. I was the lead artist at that point, and we were making the video game of the TV show 24. And although I was the lead artist, I was also the concept artist, and there just wasn't much for me to do. And I'd still been doing bits and pieces for Games Workshop. I was working, I was doing art for the trading card games, just to keep my hand in. And I was, again, still talking with John Blanche. And it became apparent that I wasn't particularly going to get a lot out of staying at Sony at that point. So I said, I'm gonna take a bit of a break, and I think I'm gonna go back to painting orcs and goblins, if that's all right. And Sony were like, well, we're sorry to see you go, but we understand. And I'd gone up to the studio, and they said, we'd like you to come back and work on our key design department as a concept artist primarily. I said, well, that sounds fun, because I didn't get to do a lot of that back in the day, and I think I'd be good at that. So yeah, it seemed like, yes, a return to a familiar environment, but also in a new capacity. So it felt like I was sort of completing the journey a little bit. So yeah, it was fun. It was fun to go back there in a concept role. Although, as I said earlier, the studio had changed quite a bit, and it wasn't quite as fun as I remembered it. But it's still an amazing creative place. But the dynamic had changed there. And ultimately, I realized that I'd probably drawn all the Space Marines I needed to.
Sure.
That's to say.
I mean, at that point in time, what did the role of a concept artist look like for the design studio? So what would have been the sort of day-to-day and the kind of briefs that you were getting?
Well, as I say, I was in the key design department, which had representation from all the various creative teams. So Jez Goodwin was on the team. There were Paul Jacob and Roberto, another couple of concept artists. Gav Thorpe was on the team. So we had writers, sculptors. Dave Andrews, who was, of course, an amazing hobbyist, was always thinking, okay, color schemes and what sort of scenery you were going to have on the tabletop and stuff. So it was really, really nice to be part of that team, because you just sit and you just bang out ideas. So you'd be talking about concepts, and then the sculpting team would pipe in and say, well, we could do this and this range, and we could do that. And Dave Andrews would go, oh, this. And then the writer would go, well, this. So it was, although the team didn't last, through no fault of our own, it was a really cool little bunch. It was a really cool group, because then you go away and you'd interact with the actual teams. So the Black Templar Codex was one I was working on, and Graham McNeil was writing that. So we'd sit and chat with Graham about some stuff, and he'd give me ideas for characters or for troop types, and I'd go back to key design and go, "Wow, I thought about this, and what about that? And we could put that in the book." Unfortunately, the studio went through a big kind of upheaval after about 18 months of me being there, because the Lord of the Rings bubble eventually burst. Return of the King had come out, and Games Workshop saw the sort of the sale. After a while, the popularity of battle games in Middle Earth just sort of took a nosedive, and they got very twitchy, and they just made some big cuts around the studio. And they, what seemed madness to me at the time, decided that the key design department was one that needed to take a hit. So that was the end of that. That's the nature of business sometimes. But at that point, a former workshop mate, co-worker of mine, Andy Chambers, had gone over to Blizzard, and he was there as the creative director on StarCraft 2. And I said, "Oh, I've always liked Blizzard games, and I'm kind of at a point now in my career that may be a big move to foreign parts. What do you think?" And he spoke to the right people. He spoke to people like Sam Didier and Chris Metzen, and they went, "Gibbons, just get him out." So that was that. That was now nearly 18 years ago.
And you've actually done some work with Andy Chambers on a game of your own that you sort of developed together, called Dark Deeds, right? Which was a kind of card game. And what was the sort of process and the journey like for creating that together?
Well, yeah. So fast forward through my 7 years at Blizzard and a couple of years at Riot, and I left to again just to try freelance again. I'd had my fill of big studios at that point, so I was kicking around here thinking, okay, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna start working on? And then I just got a call from Andy saying, "I've done a card game, need an artist." I said, "Well, tell me more." He said, "It's called Dark Deeds." I said, That's all I needed to hear. When did we start?" So it was a crazy sort of 4 months of doing all the art for that. And we released it to a little independent publisher who'd never done a game before. And we got really carried away with it. We got really indulgent with the components. We had wood tokens and a metal coin and a little burlap sack that you put it all in. And it ended up being really, really nice, but really expensive. So we did a little print run and we sold them all, and that was it. But I always wanted to return to it. I always thought it could have been a bigger game. I like all artists, I wanted to noodle on the art and do some new cards and tweak some bits. But Andy and Ryan Miller, who was the writer on that, they, like sensible game developers, had moved on. They had half a dozen other projects to go. I was still noodling away on Dark Deeds. I still wanted it to be more, to be bigger. I think it should have deserved to be a hit. And they were like, "Yeah, but fine. I'm off doing Judge Dredd and stuff." So, and then COVID came along, and I needed another project. So I decided I was going to make a new version of Dark Deeds for online play. So there was an online platform called Tabletopia, which publishers tend to use to promote the physical versions of the game. So if you don't know whether you want to buy this game yet, well, you can go play it for free on Tabletopia. I thought, well, that'd be a good format for me to sort of get what I think is the definitive version of the game made. And who knows who might see that. So I spent the COVID summer making that. And lo and behold, Chris Birch, who was the head of Modifius, who are an independent UK publisher, played it with me and said, "Oh, we'd like to do a new edition of that." And then we have this now, which is the prototype test print of the new physical edition of the game, which is at the printers, hopefully, and due for release in the spring.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I mean, again, it's just me not being prepared to move on from anything, noodling away, changing the art, tweaking the rules, improving this and that. So we're publishing that with in partnership with Modifius, but also with the studio I'm now an art director at, called Rookery Publications, which is a studio I set up along with some other former Games Workshop staffers, based in Edinburgh, Andy Law, Lindsay Law, Andy Leask, and to do, again, back to tabletop, doing our own line of role-playing games. But when the chance to revisit Dark Deeds came along, I said to my teammates, why don't we kind of, because I knew that Andy Law in particular would be an amazing help in tweaking the development and tweaking the rules and making sure it looked beautiful, because he's just one of these amazing all-rounders, you know. So he and I sat down and knocked all the rough edges off what I thought the perfect version of the game was, and went, oh no, this is the perfect version of the game. So that was an absolute treat. So yeah, it's new and shiny and not ridiculously expensive anymore. So hopefully that's going to come out in the spring, and everybody will love it, and then we can work on the next thing. So yeah, it's back in the tabletop world at last. It felt like a home. I say at last. It's been now 3 years that we've been doing this, but it felt like a real homecoming. Yeah, long may that continue.
Yeah. I mean, do you think you would explore the Dark Deeds sort of world in other ways, in other games, potentially down the line?
Well, yeah, back in the day, Andy Chambers and myself had the next game in the series sort of sketched out, which is called Dark Deities. They all have to be dark games. But and I'd done all, as always, I'd done all the art for it, but the rules were in progress. So I was up in Edinburgh the year before last, and I took my prototype up there to sit down with Andy Law and play through it. And of course, Andy had a ton of ideas. So depending on how well Dark Deeds is, I'm not sure I should be talking about this, but depending on how well Dark Deeds is received, we will definitely be moving on to Dark Deities. But between those two games, we have the Coiled Crown, which is our RPG world, which we've done a couple of PDFs that we put out on drive-through to sort of test the waters, and they went down really well. So we're close to finishing our first big adventure book for the Coiled Crown, which is called Ship of Fools. I don't know yet what format that's going to take and when that's going to come out, but again, we are talking with publishers about it. We might be a Kickstarter, and we might put it out just as a standalone or as part of something bigger. We don't know. We haven't decided, but we're going to be talking about that in the coming months. But it's all very exciting.
It certainly sounds it. Yeah, I mean, so the Rookery, would you sort of describe it as a kind of like a design collective, looking at different things and sort of creating things together? Is that how it works?
Yes. I mean, initially we were very focused on, we're going to do this big fantasy RPG line, because that was the background of because my teammates all came from Wolfrup. So that seemed to be the natural thing. But then when I came along with Dark Deeds, I said, we could do all sorts of games, couldn't we? Yeah, we could. We should do all sorts of games. So that's what we feel about it now. But yeah, I mean, the idea of bringing in other writers, certainly other artists. I'm not doing it all myself. Is our plan, and we are the Rookery in that we are yes, a nest of rooks, a parliament of rooks, but also a ramshackle collection of dilapidated Victorians. the other interpretation of Rookery. So yeah, a collective would be a good way to describe it.
That's great. Yeah, and you've also done more art for the Warhammer world through Cubicle 7's Wolfrup as well, haven't you? In more recent times.
Well, that's how I met Andy Law. Yeah, because he was commissioning art at the time, and I only did like half a dozen pieces for Rough Nights and Hard Days, but we really hit it off. So when Andy Law left Cubicle 7 and was setting up his own company, and he approached me and said, would you be interested in doing some commissions? And I said, no, you don't want to commission an artist. What you want to do is you want to get an artist involved in the company. no, we want to find an artist to partner with. And I went away. And then he came back to me a week later and said, would you like to be that artist? I said, well, funny you ask. Yes, that's how that all started off. Yeah. So again, he was just somebody that I really hit it off, and I could really see right from the get-go a kindred spirit, and he can turn his hand to so many things. I mean, he's an artist, he's an award-winning cartographer himself, So I knew that he would, and he's a perfectionist like me too, which is often a curse, but at least I have a sympathetic ear. When I say I just need to noodle on that piece of art a bit more, and he goes, I just need to change the spelling, or I need to, rephrase that paragraph in the text. We're okay with each other doing that.
Yeah. I mean, so it sounds like there's quite a lot of exciting stuff on the horizon then for you and for the Rookery, and sort of beyond even the dark deeds and whatever happens with that space. There's lots of other cool stuff in the mix, it sounds like.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. I mean, it's always a bit of a challenge to set up your own company. If it was easy, everybody would do it. But it's been really satisfying and really rewarding. If a bit of a struggle and a bit of a headache at times, but that's what happens when you take on responsibilities like this. When you're no longer an employee, or even as a freelancer. Oh no, we're gonna run our own studio now. Like, oh, this is why people don't do this. But it's I have choice. I wouldn't do anything else, because it gives you that ownership, of your work and the worlds you build. And it's kind of, you realize that as I've gotten older, I've realized how important it is to me to feel like I what I do is not mine exclusively, but that there's a sense of my babies, raising my children rather than giving them up for adoption.
Sure.
That's not too to the metaphor.
Sure, no, I understand. Yeah, I mean, I suppose looking back now on that career you had in Games Workshop, sort of, and visiting the sort of worlds of GW a couple of times in many different ways and through different companies as well. Do you have any sort of reflections on the sort of entirety of that, the totality of that experience working on Warhammer and 40K and everything else?
I mean, deeply grateful for the opportunity. I don't think. I mean, when you consider what a colossal juggernaut of just a colossal creative juggernaut it is these days. It's amazing to think that you got to have a hand in shaping any of that back in the day. When you see the enormous audience it has, when you see how successful the video games of Warhammer have been, when you hear that Henry Cavill's making a movie / TV shows with Amazon based on it, you go, well, wow, okay, yeah, that was pretty big. Yeah, I don't think it's rare that you get to appreciate that at the time. It's inevitably something that comes further down the line, unless they hire me to do some stuff with Henry Cavill. That'd be nice. I would, I'd make the time in my busy schedule to do that again on that. I mean, it's very sort of, feel very privileged to have been a part of that at all. Yeah, it's been a great honor.
Yeah, I mean, is there any?
Sorry, there's a friend of mine that a Sony mate of mine who is always looking to do new work, but he's always gets asked about his most iconic creations from the past, and I understand that too, because I'm always doing new stuff, but I always get asked about work that I used to do. But it's kind of like when you think so many artists, so many creative people never get asked about the things that they've made. I'm always happy to chat about orcs and goblins.
Sure. Well, yeah, to maybe finish by asking you about work that you used to do, and you've sort of alluded to a few pieces, but is there any sort of single piece that you sort of remember most fondly, or sort of look back on as sort of most proud piece of work?
There's not that many, because I don't want to say I don't like my art, but like a lot of artists, I don't find it that pleasurable to look at it, because all I see is the things that I could have done better. But there's a few pieces. As I said, I've got pieces based on Jez Goodwin's miniatures or concepts, and some of those are all right. You know, I've got a Eldar, a swooping hawk, a striking scorpion, and the avatar of Cain. I've still got those in my collection. I'm loath to part with. I've got a white from the Undead Army book that I still like very much. There's one Space Marine piece I've got. Oh no, there's a piece I did. I think you mentioned it in one of your podcasts. The Gene Sealer Mages fighting the Grey Knight.
Yes. Classic, amazing piece.
So that has meaning for me for a number of reasons. One, I can stand to look at it. But two, it took me 3 months to finish because I broke my arm. When I broke my arm, I was in the middle of doing that piece back in like 91. So there's history beyond the art that is pivotal in that. When I started that piece, I wasn't sure I wanted to be an artist. By the time I finished that piece, I was absolutely convinced that's what I needed to do. So that's a piece that, for big reasons, I don't see myself ever parting with.
No, but that's fascinating, though. Yeah, for a single piece of art to bridge that sort of transition in your sort of outlook and your life. That's amazing, and for it to be such an incredible piece as well. I mean, I still think the Grey Knight with his force field, he's the only one who survives the Mage's attack.
People have asked me quite recently, what's he doing with a squad of Blood Angels? And I have no idea. I don't know why I drew it with Blood Angels. I can't. No, just I don't look. I guess because I'd done a lot of Deathwing, and I wanted to paint somebody or draw someone other than Deathwing. So I went with Blood Angels. I know no more reasoning than that, I don't think.
Perhaps it was a desperate last stand in some way, and it was just whoever was around could step in. But I think those are the kind of fun stories that come from that sort of art as well.
Yeah. I don't remember if that was a commission or again, it was another one of those pieces that I just did off my own bat at the time. I think so. I don't think anyone would have said, "Can you know," because the unusual nature of the piece. I don't think Games Workshop would have said, "Can you do a Gene Stealer killing a load of Terminators?" I don't think that would have been, I think that was quite on message at the time.
Well, you need a few examples of that to really bring the sort of terror of the world to life. I think
the 41st millennium for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's a terrific sort of place for us to wrap up, Mark. And I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and sort of tell me some of your fantastic stories. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, Jordan. Lots of fun. And Martha as well. Did you, Martha?
Yeah, she's definitely made her presence known at multiple points, I think. Thank you, Mark, for joining me to talk about your career and experience. It was a real pleasure. If you want to check out more of Mark's work, I have included a link to his portfolio and to his company, The Rookery, where you can find out more information about the recently announced re-release of Dark Deeds. If you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, and my Discord, and you can use my Element Games affiliate links whenever you buy hobby supplies, because that helps support me too. You can find all of those links in the description as well. Thank you very much to Mark for joining me. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.